All right, and welcome back. So today we're going to talk about an introduction to American prehistory and the art of the Andes, and also a little bit about the archaeology of Colombia and a little bit about the archaeology, very little about the archaeology of the Amazon. So let's just jump right into it. So it's actually pretty significant as to understand how the New World came to be populated. There's several different theories regarding this, and a lot of these theories are relatively new, that only have popped up since the 1990s. The prevailing theory for most of the 20th century has been the Bering Land Bridge theory. So up here in the region of the Bering Sea, when the Ice Age was in full swing, the oceans were lower because most of the northern hemisphere was covered in a massive ice sheet. And so that created a land bridge that allowed people to cross from Asia into Alaska. And so they crossed from Siberia into Alaska. But that's not all that's going on there. There are two ice sheets here. One is on the coast and the other one is on the continent. And every once in a while, in various times of the Ice Age, they would either come together and meet, making the passage impassable, but at other times they would widen out. So it's very likely that people came through this channel at different times. They would follow the megafauna, the bison, the mastodons, the other animals into the interior of North America. They were hunters and gatherers, and so it just makes sense that they would follow the animals down in. And it may have happened more than once. It may have happened, several times as these two ice sheets spread apart and then rejoined. So the first established culture, or at least we used to think the first established culture that we see in the New World, is the Clovis culture. These people moved down into North and South America, and wherever they went, they left behind their technology. And every single tribe makes their spear points a little differently, and so you can look at a spear point and tell exactly which culture is making it. Now, the Clovis Points are remarkable because they're beautifully symmetrical, they're bifacial blades, but the most important thing is they have this hafting groove, which is an extraordinarily hard thing to do in flint knapping, is to take out this single piece that then allows you to haft a spear to it. So it's a very, very nice piece of technology. We call this the Clovis Point because they were first discovered in Clovis, New Mexico. Yay! Archaeologists, their imagination is just staggering. And the date for these was dated to around 1300, 500 BC. And that's really the earliest that anybody could find at Clovis. And so, since that was the earliest layer at Clovis, and this was one of the first established ancient prehistorical sites in America, every time they came across points that looked like these, they called them Clovis Points. And you could find these all over North and South America. And so there was a kind of, fallacy that crept into our archaeological research. What ended up happening is because that was the earliest evidence at Clovis, everybody assumed that was by far the earliest peoples in the New World. And so they would go to other sites, and wherever they dug down, they would dug down until they found Clovis Points, and they would say, oh, that's it. We've hit the bottom. Let's not dig any more because we know there's nothing beyond there. Well, you can see the intellectual fallacy to that. Just because it's the bottom one place doesn't mean it would be the bottom in some other archaeological strata. And sure enough, after we had this all figured out and assumed that there was this one culture that came through sometime around 13,000 BCE, somebody kept digging. And one of those places is very intriguing. It's a site on a river, and the river shows evidence of permanent structures, fire rings, long-term camping sites, and other stone tool technology. But it is located all the way down here, almost at the tip of South America, in Monteverde, Chile. And it dates to easily 16,000 BCE and maybe a little earlier. We do this by carbon dating. We found some wooden materials, some things from their tents, etc., and that gave us a way of, figuring out the date. Now, I hope you understand why this is a problem. Because if you assume the first people spread out into North America through the Bering Land Bridge and through this gap in the ice sheets, and that happened at 13,000 BCE, then how on earth did somebody get all the way down here 3,000 years before that? That would seem to be a problem. And of course, it threw everything into chaos. We then had to start wondering, well, did they come and did they follow the coasts in skin boats? And did they come down here and then start migrating their way back up? There's no reason why that's not possible. It also opened up the possibility that maybe there were other cultures that were coming. And then people started digging at those old sites that they had stopped at the Clovis layer and discovered, holy crap, there's stuff before the Clovis layer. Which means that Clovis was one of the first widespread cultures in the New World, but it was by no means the first. Then things get really complicated because we start finding some very odd skeletons. Kennewick Man and Spirit Cave Man. Spirit Cave Man was found right here in Utah. The Utah Lake and the Great Salt Lake were once part of an ancient prehistoric lake known as Lake Bonneville, and up on the high benches of that lake, where I'm sitting right now in Provo, Utah, where I'm recording this, would have been under 900 feet of water. But up on the high benches, you can see the old shoreline of the lake. And along that shoreline, there were caves and dwellings and people living in those caves and dwellings. And in one of those, they found this very, very ancient skeleton known as Spirit Cave Man. Kennewick Man was found by accident. A river had washed away a section of the bank, and people found it. At first, they thought it was a murder victim, but looking at it later, they discovered that it was a very, very old skeleton. Now, when the press on these first came out, the press was not carefully worded, let's put it that way. And looking at these characters, as you look at the reconstructions, and the reconstructions are fairly reliable, these people did not look like the Asiatic strains we had come to associate with Amerindian populations that had come over the Bering Land Bridge. In fact, the newspaper articles describe them as Caucasian or European looking. That caused an enormous stir. And that caused people to think a little bit differently about the people that came to the New World. Also, people started investigating the technology. If you have these Clovis blades in the New World on one side of the Bering Sea or the Bering Land Bridge, you expect to find something similar on the other side, but you don't. You instead find microblade technology, which is just as versatile, just as good at stabbing and killing things, but it's a completely different kind of technology. And so that begs the question, where do these beautiful bifacial blades come from? So people started looking for sources for these bifacial blades, and the only place they could find them was from similar blades made by the Solutreans. One small problem, the Solutreans aren't anybody in Asia. In fact, they were the people who made the cave paintings in southern Europe back in the Paleolithic. Which begs the question, if these are Solutreans, how on earth did they get over the Atlantic Ocean where there is no land bridge? Well, there was no land bridge, but there was sea ice and pack ice. And you can travel along the pack ice, paddle your way. There's plenty of animals out there, seals and whales and other things that, and whales and walruses that haul themselves up on the ice. So you can get food the whole way. And did they have the technology to do this? Well, it turns out they did. We have evidence that they had skin boats. These are boats made on wooden frames and have the skins of usually seals or walruses pulled over them and then sealed up with animal fat. This is called an umiak, and they still make them today. The modern-day Inuit make these umiak open boats, and they travel across hundreds of miles of open water along the ice shelf. So if they could do it, today, there's no doubt that people could have done it then. But this makes this whole question over whether you have Europeans settling America first very problematic. And we no longer have a concrete idea of exactly how America was peopled. The reason this is important is because a lot of this hinges on the question of cultural identity. Of course, if you are a native descendant, if you are descendant of any of the Amerindian tribes, Native American or Mexican or Quechua or any of the native tribes of Central or South America, it's something kind of offensive to suggest that maybe Europeans got here first. And in fact, when the Kennewick Man was reconstructed, there was this group of crazy Thor worshippers, these white supremacist neo-pagans who claimed this was evidence that, that the New World belongs to our ancestors. Of course, that's ludicrous because the Germanic peoples that eventually became the Norse peoples wouldn't even move into that part of Europe for thousands of years after Kennewick Man and everyone else was established. So I think you can understand why this was so offensive. Kennewick Man became the source of a very, very serious legal battle where America has cultural resource management laws that say individual Native American tribes have a right to the remains of their ancestors. The local tribes claimed him as an ancestor, even though he was very, very distant in the past. And of course, scientists and researchers wanted access to the bones. They eventually worked out a deal where they would get to look at the bones for a limited time, and then they were returned to the tribe and reinterred. But then to have, white European scientists say that this guy isn't of the same Asiatic strand that modern, Native Americans are, you could understand that got pretty hot. It got pretty political quickly. Well, a survey was done taking a look at Kennewick Man and Spirit Cave Man, and they discovered that there isn't anyone on the planet today that quite looks like them. And it's a really interesting thing. If you go back more than about 10,000, 20,000 years, you can find skeletons that look European-ish, but not exactly like Europeans today. You can find things that look Asian-ish or African-ish, but there's nobody that looks exactly like we look today. The races that we understand today didn't really exist back then. And the closest comparison they could come up to Kennewick Man were the Ainu. Now, the Ainu are a very ancient people that live in modern-day Japan. They used to be the original inhabitants of Japan. Now they mostly live on the island of Hokkaido, which is the furthest north island. And that's in the region of East Asia. And so they are an Asiatic strain, but they have much stronger nose bridges, and they do have a number of what we might regard as European-ish features. So it's clear that the Asiatic peoples who came over were very, very early Asiatic peoples. And we kind of have to get around this idea that, regions have specific races or identities. The truth is that race is probably one of the most superficial of all biological differences. And you can measure it, you can forensically look at the bones of a person by a different race and distinguish them, but it's extraordinarily superficial and probably not a good way of indicating where people came from. All of this is just to say that it's complex, and it's a lot more complex now than it was when I was going through undergraduate school. Undergraduate school, it was just like, yeah, Asians came across the Bering Land Strait, and that's where the Amerindians came from. So what does this mean? What this means is the Amerindians are probably a polyethnic group. There's probably not one source for all of the Native Americans and native inhabitants of the New World. There's probably many sources. The predominant strains are going to be Asiatic, but that may not be any one Asiatic strain. There may be several different Asiatic strains that came across the Bering Land Bridge, or they might have followed the coastal route. And there's certainly the possibility of non-Asiatic strains as well. But I think that the most important thing is to remember that this shows the great antiquity of people in the New World. People have been here in major numbers since at least 14,000 years before the present, and probably a lot earlier. I wouldn't be surprised to find out that people have been here for 24,000 to 28,000 years. In fact, there's a lot of scholars that are moving in that direction. There's one site outside the La Brea tar pits in LA where a guy claims that he's found something 135,000 years old. I mean, that's really early. That's right at the earliest history of modern humans. I don't know anybody who really believes that, but, it's, you have to consider it. It's one of those possibilities. So people have been on this continent and the New World for a very, very long time. So the next period we're going to talk about is the Archaic Period. Now, the Archaic Period is that period where people go from being hunter-gatherers to farmers, to settling agricultural societies. And these settlements are key in the development of ceramics, fiber arts, social hierarchies, all of these things. And of course, the big story in the New World is corn. Maize, what we call corn. And corn seems to have been cultivated first in the southern reaches of Mexico, in these locations, specifically the Tehuacan Valley. Tehuacan Valley, we have a cave, Coxcotlan Cave, and in Coxcotlan Cave are found the earliest evidence of the domestication of corn. In fact, this itty-bitty corn cob, see how small that thing is? That itty-bitty corn cob right there is evidence of some of the first agriculture in the New World. That's quite a far cry from the big, beautiful ears of corn that we enjoy today. But even getting that far was an achievement because those teeny little cobs of corn were actually come from another crop called teosinte, which doesn't look anything like corn. So it's the New World crops that really bring wealth and sophistication to the New World, and we can't stress this enough. Think about all the foods that you eat today. Think about potatoes and yams, and beans and squash and corn. Think about chocolate, peppers, tomatoes, avocado, all of those things. All of those are New World crops. And New World crops are very interesting. A field of corn is easily, think about a stalk of corn. A stalk of corn will have multiple ears on it, whereas a stalk of wheat just has one ear. And yeah, they're smaller, you could get more into an area, but corn is far more productive. A field of corn has easily 4 to 5 times the yield in terms of food energy as a field of wheat. And a field of potatoes has something like 10 times the food energy of a field of wheat. And so this gives a very different world. There's not very many animals that are domesticated in the New World, but to be honest, they didn't have to domesticate animals. If you've got food products that are outperforming Old World grains by 4 to 5 or 10, that's a lot of food wealth, and you don't need to domesticate animals to do that. And so this becomes the breadth of it. And in general, it has to be said, New World diets are more diverse, healthier than Old World diets were. Think about the foods you eat today. A lot of them are New World crops. And, can you imagine a world without tomatoes, peppers, and avocados? It's unreal. So all of these were very significant crops. And these become the basis of agriculture and civilization in the New World. That without this, you're not going to have social stratification, diversification of labor, complex societies with things like scribes and artists. And so agriculture is going to be at the heart of many of these civilizations. All of these civilizations are going to revere corn. Every one of these civilizations has a rejuvenating god that's a maize or a corn deity. And corn is going to be one of the most common votives that's given to gods in that way. And so this really does shape a very, very different culture. The exception of something like the llama and the alpaca, which are mostly located in the Andes, there aren't going to be a lot of domesticated animals, and there isn't going to be a lot of, wool or fiber arts, except again in Peru where there's lots of fiber arts. But there's going to be this incredible agricultural wealth, and this is what gives way to the 2 predominant cultures that emerge in the New World. So there are 2 zones, really, of major civilizations in the New World. Actually, there's probably more than that, but there's 2 that we know for certain. One might add the Mississippi culture to this, and who knows, maybe we'll add some of these unknown or lost cultures that we're seeing in the Amazon, but we'll talk more about it later. But those 2 areas are going to be South America, which is centered mostly in the Andes Mountains, a little bit of Chile, a little bit of Bolivia, a little bit of Ecuador, but mostly Peru. And this is where we're going to find the Norte-Chico cultures, Shavin, Moche, Inca, all of those cultures. The other isn't found in Central America, which we also call Mesoamerica, which just means Middle America. And it's going to include places like Belize, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, but mostly Mexico. So it's basically the story between Mexico and Peru. And it's in Mexico that we're going to see the Olmec, the Maya, the Toltec, the Aztec, the Zapotec, the Mixtec, and all these other civilizations. Now, these two civilizations have a lot in common. Of course, they have corn and agriculture in common, but they have completely different mythologies and completely different societies. Let's start with Andean Civilization. Andean Civilization is the oldest civilization in the New World. We used to think that it was the second oldest, that the Olmec were the oldest, but now the Olmec have been outclassed by the Norte-Chico culture, but we'll talk about that. The Andean civilization, of course, lives in the Andes Mountains, and it is a civilization of empires. They have vast trading networks. And by empires, we mean centralized control with civil bureaucracies and stratified societies that maintain control through trade or war. And they are going to be largely non-literate, although there's the exception with this thing called the quipu, which we'll talk about. They're also going to have much more facility with gold and metal and with fiber arts. So in Mesoamerica, they have cotton and they have maguey fiber, but they don't have much else. But in the south, they have camelid fibers from llamas and alpacas and really incredible textiles. They also have an insane amount of gold and an insane amount of silver. And they also have copper alloys. So they're incredible metal workers. Whereas in the Mesoamerican sphere, all the metal from the Mayan world, every piece of gold that was recovered from every Mayan dig could probably fit in a large shoebox. It's just not that much. The Aztecs had more, but still nothing like the Inca would have. So Mesoamerican civilization is different in quite many different ways. For one, it's not going to be a civilization of empires. Teotihuacan might be an empire. It's hard to tell. But instead, it's going to be a series of rival polities. You're going to have very powerful states like the Aztecs or the Maya who are either fighting amongst themselves or they're going to subject other polities or other states and city-states to be tribute states. So instead of exerting complete control over them like an empire would, they'll just say, hey, as long as you feed us, tribute, we won't, go conquer you. Unless, of course, we need sacrificial victims, and then we do that. Mesoamerican civilization is also far more nationalistic. They have very strong national deities, and they also have ritualized warfare and a lot more human sacrifice, it seems. Well, that may not be the case anymore. And they are literate. Every single one of them has some kind of writing, of record keeping. The Mayan have the most sophisticated form of record keeping with full, writing systems, but all of them have some kind of record keeping or writing system. So you can see that, the Inca, for example, have an empire that spans all the way from Colombia down to the very tip of Chile. That's really incredible. The Aztecs don't control much more than the Mexican, the valley and around the Mexican basin of what is now modern-day Mexico City. That's quite a bit different, and it shows the sense of scale in these two. Sacrifice and religion are going to be major features of both cultures. Both cultures have a strong affinity for religion and tradition and their gods, and one of the major features of that is sacrifice. The Mayans practiced routine ritualized warfare. The Aztecs sacrificed lots of people. We used to think that the Andean civilizations only practiced human sacrifice every once in a while, but now we think that may be in error. We're seeing more and more evidence. There's some excavations going on at Chimu in Chanchan, for example, where they're discovering, burials of 800 victims that were done simultaneously. So that's not a minor deal. This also ends up being true of Mississippi cultures too, of North American cultures. So when we look at writing, the Aztec, of course, had, that the Mayan had very, very sophisticated writers, scribes, had full histories. The Aztecs don't have a full, complete writing system. It's more like a pictograph system, but it does much the same things, and they also have recorded histories. Whereas in the Andean sphere, they have the phenomenon of the quipu. Now, the quipu is a strange thing. It is a series of knots tied in threads, and the length of the thread, the color and the texture of the thread, and the location and type of knots all encode information. For the longest time, people thought this was only the most simplest kind of record keeping, that it recorded things like dates or numbers or censuses or tallies for tribute, things like that. Now, that opinion is beginning to change. There's a couple of new studies that came out, I think I mentioned this earlier, where a doctoral student went and he convinced these villages high up in the Andes Mountains, it took years to gain their trust, to let him see their quipus, because they still had some of these, and to talk about their traditions. And we now know that historical dates and historical information are encoded in these as well. So who knows? There could be a great, store of information in these that has since been lost. So that's the basics of the prehistory of America and the differences between the two cultures. What I want to talk about now is we'll talk about Andean civilization. Next week, we'll start with Mesoamerican civilization, but I want to go through Andean civilization. And to understand Andean civilization, you really need to understand the geography of the Andes. The Andes are the second highest mountains on the planet, pretty significant. And those mountains act as a colossal rain shadow. Living here in Utah, you should know what a rain shadow is, because we're living in one. The Sierra Nevadas scrape most of the moisture one way, and the Rockies scrape most of the moisture the other way. So we have this big desert in between those two mountain ranges, known as the Great Basin. And if you're in Utah, you're pretty much living in it. And so the same thing happens down in Peru and in the Andes Mountains. You have these mountains, they scrape all the moisture off on one side. And so you end up on the east side of the Andes, you have these cloud forests and rainforests, where it's incredibly green and lush. Then in the Andes Mountains itself, you have this semi-arid region. It's known for salt flats and scrubland, and you can graze there, but it's pretty high altitude. It's usually over 10,000 feet or higher. Some of these cities are like at 14,000 feet. Timpanogos Mountain, which overlooks the Utah Valley here, is about 12. So, imagine cities another couple thousand feet higher than that. Yikes. So it's a rugged environment, but it's lush compared to the coastal deserts. The coastal deserts are some of the driest deserts on Earth. The Atacama Desert gets about 3 inches of rain a year. That's insanely dry. When you think about Utah, Utah gets about 11 inches of rain a year, and it's a desert, so this is even less than that. Yikes. Utah's a beautiful place. I love Utah, but I always tell people who ask, so should I move to Utah? And I said, yeah, it's a beautiful place as long as you don't have to farm it. Give up your hopes of a nice vegetable garden. I used to live in Philadelphia, and oh my gosh, things just came up like weeds, and you would tell people about lawns with sprinklers to keep the lawns from dying, and they would go, what are these lawn sprinklers you speak of? Because they never water their lawn because there was plenty of rain. And I just broke my back this summer putting in a sprinkler system for my wife, and it was brutal. But that's what you got to do out here to keep things alive. Imagine trying to do that with, holy crap, 9 inches of less rain, or 8 or 9 inches of less rain. Strangely enough, though, it's the coastal deserts where most of the early civilizations thrive. And you might say, why? Why are they in the deserts? Well, because the Andes Mountains are so tall, you have these huge high valleys with snowpack, with glaciers, and those glaciers feed river valleys, and those have rivers. So even though this place is really dry, there are perennial rivers that run all the time. And that means you can irrigate. And with irrigation, you can build civilization anywhere. And it's just like Sumeria. Ancient Sumeria civilization started there because they had no rain, but they had rivers, and they had desert, and with that, you can irrigate. And that's pretty much the story of how Utah managed to survive through the Pioneer period anyway. So we're going to be talking a lot about those coastal deserts. They're also amazing because they tend to be dry and arid and cold, and thereby they preserve a lot of beautiful materials. So we get a lot of textiles that we wouldn't otherwise get. And so this is our chronology. Chronology in the Andean sphere is broken down by horizons. So you have early horizon cultures, and those are going to be cultures like the Shavin cultures. You have middle horizon cultures, which are going to be cultures like Wari, Tiwanaku. And then you have late horizon cultures like the Chimu and the Inca. And they're more or less analogous to what would be the pre-classic, classic, and post-classic in the Mesoamerican sphere. But then we also have a new civilization that's only recently been discovered that is way before any of this. And that's the Norte-Chico, sometimes called the Kalasasaya culture. And we'll talk about them in a bit. We also talk a little bit about Andean cosmology, mythology, and religion, because religion is so important to the region. Most of what we know about Andean religion, we can only infer from what we know about Incan religion and mythology. The Inca were a civilization that were conquered at the time of the conquistadors, but many of the records of the Quechua, that is the native language of the people that lived in the Andes Mountains, that was recorded. So we know the names of their gods, we know their rituals, etc. And unfortunately, earlier Andean civilizations are not literate, so we cannot tell for certain what they called their gods or what they believed in, but the iconography of their art suggests that it's similar to the Incans. So we are looking at the Inca and projecting backwards. That's really the best we can do. We're going to talk about a little bit about their mythology. We're also going to talk about the hierarchy of gods and the concept of divine kingship. And also we're going to talk about some of their more sacred places, or wakas. So starting off, there is one god that's more important than all the other gods. The Incas called him Viracocha, but we generally know him as the staff god, because he's a god that holds staffs. Again, if your child has no imagination, encourage them to go into archaeology. Anyhow, and one of the things that's really interesting is that the Sapa Inca, that is the emperor of the Inca, claimed to be the descendant of Viracocha. So nearly all of these kings and rulers appear to be divine kings. That is, they either are descended from the gods, or they have a divine mandate to rule. So the gods and the state religion are one and the same. And you can recognize the staff god because he's carrying staves. These are probably personifications of lightning. You'll notice that he has serpent heads coming out of his head. Generally, when we see serpents, those generally mean anything that moves. Anything that moves like water or lightning or fire or smoke or blood is personified as a serpent or as some kind of animal. Viracocha is the earth shaker, the creator god. You can see that tears stream down his face. These bring the waters and the rains. And then his head is like a solar crown. And then presumably the staffs represent lightning or authority or power or something in that way. There are other very important deities. Pachamama is an earth or fertility goddess. There are also gods of celestial phenomenon. There's Inti and Kia. These are gods of the sun and the moon. The sun Inti is very important to the Inca. And there's also many local or specialized gods. There's a belief that every river or stream or mountain has an associated god or deity as well. There is an understanding that the middle world, that is the Ke-Pacha, the mortal world, is where we live, and the Uka-Pacha is the lower world, where you have underworld deities, and Hanan-Pacha is the higher world, the world of Viracocha and other gods. So there is a much more stable universe in Andean cosmology than there is in, say, Mesoamerican cosmology. When we get to Mesoamerican cosmology is constantly in a state of turmoil, of birth and rebirth. That's not the case. In the Andean world, the world is very stable. You have a single creator god, and then all the other gods are tiered beneath him. The other thing that's very important is the concept of wakas. Wakas, sometimes spelled huacas, are any spiritual or sacred place. Wakas can be artificials, like pyramids or platforms, but they are also usually typically natural things that exist in the world. So there are huge wakas like platforms. This one is from the Moche culture, Huaca da Luna. This is the Waka of the Sun. There are also ushnus. These are platforms. Some of these platforms are designed as places for the Inca, the Sapa Inca, to come, or the representative of the Sapa Inca to reside. So again, the idea is these platforms elevate the place of worship above the mundane plane. Sacred stones that stick out, natural landmarks, are often very sacred. This is the Kenko Stone. It's just outside Cusco. But also lakes are very sacred. Lake Titicaca, for example. Stop giggling. So Lake Titicaca, for example, if you are a scuba diver there, you may have to keep out a wary eye because there are lots of gold and silver artifacts that are dropped into sacred or high lakes as forms of offerings, because this is the access to the underworld, to the pacha beneath, to the world that is accessed only through like water or caves. If you see something, though, don't touch it. Tell somebody, tell an archaeologist, but don't touch it because it's illegal to take it. But, still, it'd be pretty cool to see. And then there's, of course, mountains. Again, second highest mountains in the world. It would be obvious that these would be sacred. And these are often sites of offerings. In this case, we have human sacrifice. These bundles are called mummy bundles, although they're not deliberately mummified like Egyptian mummies. Rather, they're so high up in the sky, and it's so arid and so cold and so dry that they become naturally mummified. When we unwind some of these bundles, you can see that this one was a child. Look how immaculately braided her hair is. She's wearing silver. She was buried with all kinds of votives, including a doll wrapped up in textiles. Again, there's not much evidence that sacrifice was very common amongst the Inca. They did perform sacrifice, but usually when the Sapa Inca died, or there was some drought or calamity or crisis, that was what called for sacrifice. And the most precious sacrifices are going to be royals, nobles, because they're higher up in the chain, so they're more of a prestigious sacrifice. So this girl was probably, by her dress and her appearance and how well she was taken care of, was a noble. She was probably a princess. And there's evidence that they gave her drugs and had her chew coca leaves to numb the pain and to knock her out. And then once she was unconscious, they strangled her, they garroted her, and then left her there as an offering on the mountain. And she almost certainly went willingly. So let's talk about some of the specific cultures. The oldest culture in the New World is now confirmed to be the Norte-Chico culture. This is an incredible find, and it's important to note that when I went to school, nobody even heard about this. Nobody knew what this was. The excavations only really happened in 2003, 2004. Most of the publications were not printed and published until 2008, 2010. So I graduated with my PhD in 2008, so I only heard about this after the fact. It's really amazing. And there's enough evidence to suggest that it is the Ur culture of all Andean civilizations. What do we mean by an Ur culture? An Ur culture is the mother culture. It's the first culture. The first city in Sumeria is Ur, and so Ur is the Ur culture of Sumeria. So all other, first civilizations. Now, the funny thing is, we used to think Shavin was the Ur culture of Andean civilization, but we now know that Shavin is an upstart, a come lately. The Norte-Chico Carol Supe culture predates Shavin by just an insane period of time. So this site was known. People knew about it. There were pyramids out there. There were ruins. But nobody had excavated there. Some people had poked around in the 60s and assumed that they were pretty much Middle Horizon sites, because there's other Middle Horizon sites around. But when they started excavating them, wow, they found some pretty impressive pyramids and other features as well. And then they also found organic matter, carbon matter, and with that they could date, and the dates were coming back, some as old as 3000 BC. I want to stress that not only makes them the oldest civilization in the New World, that makes them the second oldest civilization on the Earth. Only Sumerians are older. That's just incredible. These guys are getting started right at the same time that Egypt is getting started. It's just really insane how old this is. And when we look at them, we have these very complex pyramids that are wakas. In the New World, you don't build a new pyramid. You just kind of, you don't tear down the old pyramid, you just build the new pyramid on top of it because the structure is sacred. So they're like nested Russian dolls where one pyramid is perfectly preserved inside the other, and sure enough, you can see here there are many, many layers that exist. There are also intentional votive deposits, chambers where they would bury either mummies or the deceased or nobles or make offerings or sacrifices. They also have this sunken courtyard, which is astonishing because we all assumed that sunken courtyards started with the Shavin culture, and yet here they are much earlier. So reconstructed, you have some kind of ceremonial center, the courtyard, and then you have a pyramid, and on top of the pyramid, a series of complexes, and buried into the pyramid, we have votive offerings. Now, this is a pre-pottery culture. They hadn't yet invented ceramics, so the offerings are going to be made out of things like limestone or plaster. We do have some textiles, though, and we have what may be the first ever quipu. So this is astonishing. No one ever would have dreamed that quipus were this old. So if you have things this old, that indicates this truly is the Ur culture. But what happened to them is something of a mystery. We also have the first ever depictions of the staff god. We have a gourd with the image of a staff god on it. So that shows that this is, in fact, the mother of all these other Andean civilizations. But then it disappears, and for several centuries there's nothing. So we are on a hunt. We are in a search to figure out where are these older civilizations that connect the earliest civilizations, which our next culture, which is the Shavin culture. So this was previously regarded as the Ur culture for Andean peoples. And we don't know if this is a nation that's building this or whether this is a bunch of villages coming together. So this could be either a capital with a nation state, or it could be just a common religious site that everybody comes to and contributes to. But we find a massive temple, and in addition to the temple, we also find beautiful artifacts, including some of the first artifacts made in metal and gold. So the Shavin culture is this period right here, and let's just take a look at the temple. So here's the temple as it exists today, and here's a reconstruction that shows the Sunken Plaza. Notice the circular Sunken Plaza that we saw at Norte-Chico. And here's what it looks like today after some restoration. So out front we have the Sunken Plaza, and in the Sunken Plaza we have this beautiful ashlar masonry wall. An ashlar masonry wall is a wall that is made out of regular orthogonal or kind of rectangular bricks, and you can see that here. And stuck in this we have these tenon heads. The tenon heads are carved in the faces of jaguars, but they also have humanistic qualities. So these might be shaman or shaman that are transforming into jaguars. We often call this shamanistic transformation. When we get a little further on, you go up from the courtyard to what is known as the black and white portal. The black and white portal is so named because it has one stone that is got a black patina and another one that's white. Wow. I don't think I'll ever be clever enough to be an archaeologist. But at any rate, on these, and you have this beautiful masonry, fine cut edges, and engraved on the masonry are these godlike figures that are terrifying. I love them because on their feet and on their knees and on the masks they wear, we have these terrifying faces. Is this a performer dressed up like this? Impersonating the god for a performance or a procession, or is this in fact, the god himself? It's really kind of hard to tell. As we move to the circular courtyard, this is what it looks like today, but once upon a time it had similar, very finely made, masonry. And on those masonry blocks, it's very hard to see here, but we have these beautifully stylized jaguars. Jaguars are probably the biggest predator, biggest cat in the New World. And then we also likewise have these representations of gods with these fang-like faces and snake-like hair with terrible claw-like feet. This thing is an absolute maze, total Lara Croft, Tomb Raider adventure. And it was backfilled with earth, but excavating it, you find a whole series of tunnels. And at one of these crossings in these tunnels, we'll find this very significant stone, the Lanson Stone. The Lanson Stone means lance, and the stone is a natural stone. It has this shape naturally. And it's another one of these wakas. It's a natural artifact that the local people looked at and said, wow, this must have some significance. And they engraved the stone, again with one of these terrifying fanged faces, to represent the god that they saw inside of it. And it's you can understand why they call it a lance stone, because it's very sharp, very blade-like. But if you unfold the drawing on either side, you get this terrifying figure with clawed hands and feet and a fanged visage. This clearly represents one of their deities or gods, but exactly who we can't say. It's the Shavin culture that we first see one of the hallmarks of all Andean civilization, that is the Stirrup Vessel. And here you can see the Stirrup Vessel made in both ceramic and gold. I love the patterning on the gold one. This is actually a jaguar, see the head here? And it's interlacing with another jaguar head, so they're alternating. It's really beautiful. And it's very stylized. That patterning is based on textiles. We only have a few textiles from the Shavin period, but that's evidence that they did have sophisticated textiles. The Stirrup Vessel is just a brilliant piece of design. In fact, it's a better design than our modern bottles. Have you ever tipped up a bottle? Ever tipped up a brewski, a cold one? Yeah, I'm about the most inauthentic bro out there. I don't drink. So, I don't know. But if you ever tip up a bottle, I drink Coke. I drink Coke from the bottle. It glugs. Air has to come in the same passage that the fluid is coming out, so it glugs and it can splash and make a mess. Well, if you have a stirrup vessel like this, air can go in the one side while liquid comes out the other. And then it also makes a convenient handle that you can hold on to. It's really a brilliant design. It's one of these characteristic pieces of Andean design. Well, that will take us to the Paracas culture. The Paracas culture is the next early horizon culture, and they're very famous for their mummies and their textiles, as you can see here. Paracas is, again, one of these dry coastal deserts. It's so dry that it naturally mummifies people that are buried here. They would make these man-made caves called cavernas, and they would bury the mummies at the very bottom. And they would wrap them in layer after layer of textiles. These textiles would allow the moisture to wick out slowly, and therefore they would be preserved. So because it's so cold and dry, it naturally preserves them. So they're not mummified like Egyptians are intentionally. Rather, they kind of become mummified because of the climate. Notice that they sat them upright, that they're kind of seated in an upright position. This is something we know of a lot of the Incan mummies, that there was the sense that your ancestors were still alive. They probably brought votives and gifts to them, and so you can see that by sitting them upright, it gives them that sense of being alive. We also see that a number of the skulls of these figures are elongated. Okay, I know you've seen a lot of Ancient Aliens on the History Channel. I know some of you have listened to Joe Rogan and Graham Hancock, and so let me just debunk it. This has nothing to do with aliens. It is not aliens. Okay, this is an extreme form of body modification. So you have little kids, if you've ever had a little baby, you know that they have soft spots in their heads. The plates of their skull aren't quite stitched together. When I was a rookie dad, I was terrified I was going to put a thumb through them like an overripe melon. You can see the pulse through it. It's really kind of creepy. But this does allow for an extreme form of body modification, because if you bind these infants' heads, you have to do it gradually over a long period of time, and it's a skill, it's something that takes a while to develop, you can get them to get these really tall, crown-like heads. So the question is, okay, why would you do this? Well, first, it's important to know that only elites really could afford to do this and had the skill to do this. And anytime we see this kind of extreme body modification, whether it's ritual scarification in Africa, tattoo amongst the Samoans, it has the same purpose. It sets elites apart from ordinary people. So if you walk into a village and you have one of these tall, heads, cone-shaped heads, everybody knows you're an elite. There's no way to deny it. It's built right into the system. And of course, everybody asks, doesn't this hurt the babies? As it turns out, no. There were still a few tribes doing this right up until the 19th and 20th centuries. And there's no evidence that this gave them any kind of brain damage or mental disability. If it's done gradually and correctly, brains, kind of like Play-Doh, you can squish it into any shape you want, as long as you don't do it quickly. You do it quickly, that's called a concussion. Do it slowly, that's head binding, and it's a completely different thing. So, but of course, the real star of the show is these beautiful, beautiful textiles that are just so gorgeous. I mean, how come no one thinks an alien made these? These are so freaking beautiful. This is the thing I would think was made by an alien. But anyway, moving on. So these often have elaborate patterns. Here you can see how the warp and the weave of the fabric give you this almost 8-bit-like texture. It gives you this kind of geometric quality. I love this kind of figure with the serpent-like ears and serpent-like tail. This is done on a backstrap loom. This is just the simplest technology. It's still being used today in the Andes Mountains amongst the Quechua. With the tension provided by the backstrap and a shedding stick, you can create really complicated and beautiful pieces. This is a poncho, so this would go over the top of your shoulders and then has this fringe which goes down in front. But we also see beautiful things like these head turbans and other cloths. And that brings us to the Nazca culture, which is also known for its mummy bundles and its ceramics. The Nazcas don't have as quite rich of textiles, but they would bundle their figures in textiles and give them offerings as well. Their ceramics are truly just beautiful. These wonderfully polychromed ceramics that look as neat and as new today as the day they were buried. These ones show various figures and deities, but my favorite are the effigy vessels that look like sea monsters or orcas or lobsters. They live on the sea. It's right on the coast, and they certainly fished and knew about the animals of the sea, so that makes sense. And now we're going to talk about aliens again. Okay, Nazca Lines. All right, so the Nazca Lines are the most famous of the creations of the Nazca people. And again, they have nothing to do with aliens. People say, well, they were made to be seen from the sky, so they must have made these either for aliens to be seen from the sky, or they must have had, flying technology in order to see them. I want to point out that many of these are in the foothills of the Andes Mountains, the second tallest mountains in the world. When you make things on the side of hills and foothills, you can see them for miles. I live in a valley with a gigantic Y on the hill, and you can clearly see it. And these are the same way. You can either go up in the hill and look down on them. You don't need an airplane to make these things. Besides which, there are people who make corn mazes and corn art, and they don't have airplanes. Just all you need is a little bit of plotting. So, no, they're not made by aliens. And even if they are made as an offering to being something seen by the sky, well, there are these things called gods, and they believe they live in the sky, so it's just really infuriating. They're really amazing. There's a whole series of these glyphs. Many of them take animal forms like spiders or monkeys. The technology to make these is really simple. The desert has a natural patina over the surface of it, and the rocks are oxidized to a dark black color, but underneath that there's a white subsurface. So all you need to do is to remove the rock from the upper part, and that exposes the white underbelly, if you will. The real amazing thing is the scale. We have a whole variety of forms. The glyphs are the most famous, but there are also wide plazas. I know people think these are alien runways. They're not. And there's also straight lines. Some of the lines have been suggested to have astronomical significance, that they align with locations where Venus arises on the horizon. Venus is a very important star. It's the morning star and the evening star. It's closest to the sun. So that's a possibility. The one thing we do know about them is that they are ritual pathways. If you look at these things, they often follow a single line. take a look at this tree glyph. You would walk the path and walk all the way around the outer part of the tree before you walk to the inner part, all the way through the roots and then out the other side. There's a single line and it doesn't cross itself once. That strongly suggests that what these are is they're procession sites, that these are meant to support rituals, that by walking the path of these glyphs you are reinforcing what these glyphs mean. You can actually see this. I can go back to one of the earlier slides. You can see this in the spider, that you walk in through the spider's foot, you go all the way around the spider and then exit out the spider's foot. You can also see it in the monkey. The monkey is a little bit more inelegant because you go through his tail, spiral all the way out, and then exit out his backside. It's a little bit funny. As far as what they mean, the answer is we don't know. Clearly they have this ritual purpose. Everything in the world has been suggested, including aliens. But some have suggested that they represent constellations. That's possible. But I think it's more this ritual aspect than anything. Well, we move out of the early horizon cultures and into the intermediate and middle horizon cultures. The middle horizon cultures are things like Lima, Peru, and it's known for this massive waka in the center of Lima, Peru. There you can see the modern city, and also some really beautiful ceramics. Here the waka is right in the center of the modern city. Most of it is still unexcavated, but parts of it have been restored, and in the parts that have been restored, they have found burials inside massive ceramic urns, or burials wrapped up in raw wool. Once we move on past Lima, we move to the middle horizon cultures of the Moche. And the Moche are most famous for their beautiful ceramics. We have these incredible stirrup vessels, and these are portraits of rulers. The Moche are the most naturalistic of all the artists in the Andean region. Why we see it here and not elsewhere is really kind of a mystery. We suspect it's because we have this very strong rule of highly personalized rulers, and that makes sense. Whenever you see more naturalistic portraiture, it means that the ruler wants you to remember not just his family and not just his rule, but him specifically. And so you have these wonderfully naturalistic portraits. We also have a number of what we call effigy vessels. These are vessels that represent all kinds of things. There are 5 peaks around the valley, and so these represent the 5 peaks of the valley. And these appear to be warriors that have been thrown down the valleys as sacrificial victims. So you see them laying here. And that probably is representing the streams that come down the valleys. This person is actually sacrificed right on the peak with his hair, kind of flowing down. A lot of these effigy vessels have skeletons on them, and the skeletons are often very strange. We often see skeletons with families, I love this little cute family. The other thing we see is erotic vessels. Every kind of sexual act in every kind of combination of male and female, homosexual and heterosexual is depicted. That's really interesting. I'm not going to show it here because I don't want to get another strike on YouTube. And they all seem to be related. It's kind of strange. I read a recent article that said there's definitely this association with death, sex, and the sacrifice. Something connects all of these 3 things together in the Moche mind. We do have a few vessels that depict sacrifice. This one is interesting because we see a long pole, and the pole has a jaguar head on either end, and the jaguar is eating a heart. And then under that we have another pole, and on this pole is a throne. And if you look at this pole here, let me just erase this, you can tell that there are little thrones on this pole as well. So this is a litter. A litter is something you use to carry around a noble or a king. And we know that in their tradition, the Sapa Inca was divine. He was not allowed to touch the ground. So these are probably gods here, being born up by this. And we see that they have a sacrificial knife. And down below, we have another actual litter. And then we have a person bound, ready to be sacrificed. We can also see some of these sacrificial themes at the major huacas in the valley. So we have the Huaca del Sol and the Huaca del Luna. The Huaca del Sol is unfortunately half torn down. A river washed half of it, and then a bunch of it was kind of torn down in a treasure hunt. But the Huaca del Luna is more or less intact, made out of mud brick. But on the interior, we have a whole wall of preserved frescoes. This is this terrifying visage that's known as Ayapachi, the Decapitator. But notice the stylized decoration, again borrowed from textiles. The far wall has a representation of spiders, a common motif in Andean art, and then a whole collection of what appear to be either deities or figures. Down at the bottom, we have prisoners. You can tell they're prisoners because they're bound at the neck, and these are probably sacrificial victims. And then over here in the stucco reliefs, we actually have warriors. These warriors are carrying war maces. They have these big club ends. These are gigantic poles made out of metal that had a mace end on one side. They even got a smaller war club attached to it. It's got a pointy end. I'm not sure which one I'd rather get hit by, the pointy end or the blunt end. Probably the most significant site discovered amongst the Moche is going to be the tomb of the Lord of Sipan, which was found in Sipan in the Lambayeque Valley. When it was excavated by Walter Alva in 1987, it was kind of like a tomb of Tutankhamun, but in the Andean zone. Incredible amount of wealth. We have a king buried in the center. He is surrounded by attendants and other sacrificial victims, and just loaded up with gold of every kind, collars and ear spools. Here you can see that his collars have been laid out around him. He has a collar made up of peanuts, some in silver, some in gold. He has a nose and eye covering to protect him, and these nose jewels that covered his mouth, as well as a collar made out of shell beads and these enormous headdresses. This is one of those maces made out of copper alloy that would have been a weapon. As we reconstruct this guy from the original, he would have been quite a spectacular character. There's a couple of different reconstructions. Here you can see his warriors holding on to their mace like that. Beautiful stuff. Well, now we move firmly into the Middle Horizon period. In the Middle Horizon period, we are entering into a period of empires. The Wari and the Tiwanaku are real empires that control vast territories and are precursors to the Chimu and the Inca. The Tiwanaku are the first that are not centered in Peru. They are actually centered in Bolivia, and we're going to talk about them first. So they're down here on the southern end of Lake Titicaca. Are you done giggling? Okay. Now, how many of you thought about Animaniacs? Be honest. I want to see hands. Yeah. Those of you who are kids of the 90s or have that kind of nostalgia. So Tiwanaku is down here at the southern end of Lake Titicaca in the Altiplano region. And the thing that Tiwanaku is known for is these massive monolithic constructions. Monolith means they're made from just solid blocks of stone. And they're actually made out of basalt. Basalt is a very hard stone to work. So we'll take a look at principally two sites. We're going to be looking at the Kalasasaya Temple, which is the Temple of Standing Stones. And then we'll be looking at the Gate of Pumapunku, which is the Gate of the Puma. When you see Pumapunku, it's just completely disassembled. The blocks have long since been knocked down and scattered, and to a way that it's actually hard to get a sense of what this structure actually looked like. But when you look at the stones, they are immaculately carved. Remember, they're doing this without iron tools, and so most of this is being done with stone tools because copper alloy isn't hard enough to carve these stones. And so they're doing this with lots of polishing stones. I know this is another one of these things that people say, no human could make these. They must be made by... No, humans can make these. It's just a lot of effort, and you have to know what you're doing. For the longest time, nobody knew quite what this looked like, and then a team out of Berkeley actually managed to reconstruct it into this series of galleries. But what I love is how they did it. They scanned all of the blocks on the site, and then they 3D printed them up like little toys, and then they got a bunch of graduate students to just put all the pieces together until they found out which ones fit. So, your Lego building skills might be useful in archaeology. So I know I give archaeologists a lot of crap, but that was pretty imaginative. That was cool that they actually figured that out. And so what we see are a bunch of series of pavilions with gates and niches. We have to assume that those niches would have been filled with offerings or votives or idols. The Temple of Kalasasaya is really intriguing because we have a series of sandstones or basalt stones that are more or less just natural monoliths that haven't been tooled very much at all. And they've been built into a sunken plaza. So here you can see the natural stone. Again, these stones are probably waka. They're probably stones that were believed to hold the presence of the god or a sacred presence in and of themselves. So you were forbidden from tooling them too much. And then around those, you would fill this in with ashlar masonry and then again tenon heads, much as we saw in Shavin. We also have the two gates, the Gate of the Moon and the Gate of the Sun. These are massive monolithic blocks carved into gates. It's just incredible craftsmanship. We don't know what the people of Tiwanaku called these. We call them the Gate of the Sun and the Gate of the Moon. They're kind of romantic titles. We really don't know what purpose they served, other than as gateways into precincts of this sacred area. This is the gate as it's been restored. This is what it looked like when it was originally discovered. When we look at the Gate of the Sun, it has a representation of the staff god, one of the most famous representations of the staff god, possibly Viracocha. And then he is surrounded by 16 bird-headed figures with staffs, and also 32 human-headed figures, and also 16 deity heads. So no one believes that's an accident. No one can align that with anything. It seems like a calendrical system or a number system. It was obviously significant to them, but nobody can quite align that with anything in the mythology that we know. So if you have an afternoon, go down and crack the mystery of it. Shine a crystal on it. Find the ancient alien ship or ancient technology and fly it down to me, and I'll give you an A for your project. So here you see Viracocha, the staff god, holding the staffs. You can see the tears running down his face, which makes the waters and the rains of the earth, and he stands on a mountain or a platform. Standard kind of representation. Then we move to the Wari. The Wari are this other empire, but they're up north. And they're in the valley of Cusco, Peru, on the other end of the valley from where the Inca settle. And they are there in the Andean highlands and coastal deserts. They too were quite crafty when it comes to ceramics. Here is this beautiful polychromed vessel that again has another representation of the staff god. Again, I love how he has these serpents running down his cheek, representing the waters, and all of these animals coming out of his head. They too made mummy bundles, and I like how, again, this mummy bundle is given a head and a turban and a tunic to indicate that it is alive somehow. And they probably treated these mummy bundles as ancestors and venerated them. There's stories that in the 14 Sapa Inca that preceded Atalapa, that they actually mummified their bodies and put them in the Coricancha temple, and that they would go and talk to them and ask for their advice. It's really kind of interesting. But the Wari also build massive cities, and these cities were laid out on grid plans with gates and precincts and massive basalt carvings. So again, it's just evidence of this massive civil bureaucracy. Shows how much better organized they are than many of the other cultures in the New World. And that brings us to the Sakan. So the Sakan are probably the descendants of the Moche culture. We sometimes call them the Lambayeque culture because they are in the Lambayeque region of the Peruvian coast. And the Sakan are known for the insane amounts of gold artifacts that they produce. There's lots of pyramids in this valley. They're made out of mud brick. And for the longest time, these were owned by private families. And the private families, even right up until halfway through the 20th century, treated them as their own personal gold mines. They would take bulldozers and and diggers and just dig down until they found gold, and they would sell these on the art market. So there's a lot of Sakan stuff scattered in the museums around the world, but unfortunately there's no context, because this wasn't done for archaeology. This was treasure hunting for the sake of it. Finally, Peru managed to create some much stronger cultural resource management laws that prevented this legalized looting of these pyramids. But even now, every once in a while, somebody will bulldoze a pyramid. There was one that was bulldozed a few years back, and it was a huge scandal. It was on private land, and it shouldn't have been bulldozed, but it was. So it happens. So the artifacts we find are really incredible. These are tumi, these are ceremonial blades. You can see that the blades are made out of a mixture of copper and silver. This one even has kind of a checkerboard pattern. It's two different metals fused together. The handles are made out of gold, and we see a figure who himself is holding a tumi. And so these are probably representations of deities or kings. We also have these ornate ceremonial masks with nose jewels, and it says a lot about how much gold you have, that you have so much gold you can afford to paint it red. One of the more interesting things that comes out of these finds are these inverted vessels. So this is a vessel that you fill with some kind of liquid, probably something like a corn mash or alcoholic liquid that would be offered to the god. And these are probably representations of gods of the underworld. And the fun thing about this is that, when you pour the liquid out, the head is now right side up. So it functions as the god itself, or something of that nature. It's kind of a fun little mechanic. And then we get to the Chimu. The Chimu are there in the Andean highlands. Their capital is in Chonchon. And they're a middle to late horizon culture, conquered by the Inca. And so they're very important because they give us a sense of what Incan civilization is like. Because oftentimes the Incan stuff was melted down by the conquistadors. So we don't have a lot of gold from the Inca, but we do from the Chimu, and it is just astonishing. Here we have this fabulous headdress. Notice the two monkeys, and then the top of the headdress is made to look like an owl with its eyes and beak. These are ear spools. These are ear spools here, and then these beads are attached to them. Man, can imagine that. The nose jewels made in silver and gold. There's literally dozens of these. The wealth is astonishing. And of course, all of this is preserved because it was already buried in the ground long before the Spaniards showed up. Here you can see another two of these ear spools. Notice again that we have a figure who probably represents a ruler. He himself carries a cup and a tumi, a ceremonial knife, and he is carried on a litter by two bearers, again, because he is sacred. But we also find incredible textiles as well as feathered headdresses. So we don't find a lot of feathered headdresses, and also shell headdresses as well. Their architecture is pretty impressive, considering the fact that it's made out of almost exclusively mud brick. We have a series of these precincts and sacred precincts. The walls are often decorated in motifs that, again, are borrowed from textiles. Here we have birds on the bottom, but I love this pattern. This is a river. You can see the fish going through the river. Other places you can see, it looks almost like Space Invaders or something 8-bit, something very retro, but that's the textile technique coming into it. And then we get to the Inca. So it's important to know the Inca didn't call themselves the Inca. The name for themselves, and I'm not going to try and pronounce it because I'm gringo impaired, are 4 parts together. That is the 4 parts of the compass drawn together. The name Inca actually refers to the Sapa Inca. The Sapa Inca is the ruler of the Inca. He is regarded to be divine and come from the descent of the gods. He himself would act as the high priest to Inti, the sun god, and his sister would act as the high priestess to Kia, the moon goddess. And they had a massive civil bureaucracy. They're very famous for their metalworking and their incredible masonry. They are a very short civilization. They don't really last all that long. They are this high point right here at the tail end of the period. And when the Spaniards met them, boy, the timing was just perfect for the Spaniards, terrible for the Inca, because they had just come out of a civil war. Atahualpa had defeated his brother, Huascar, for control, and so they were already in a weakened state of chaos. But when they came together, they really should have been able to defeat the Spaniards. There's many accounts of how when Atahualpa comes out, he is attended by thousands of his soldiers. He's carried on a massive litter. There are 40 women behind him that if a hair fell off his head, they would eat it to prevent it from falling to the ground. That's how sacred he was. He could easily command 40,000 warriors, and even with gunpowders and cannons, they could have easily overwhelmed the Spaniards. But Pizarro was a cagey Spaniard, and he recognized immediately that their weakness was the Sapa Inca himself, that they could sacrifice thousands, but they couldn't sacrifice the Sapa Inca because he himself was divine. So he immediately captured him and held him for ransom. And with that, he managed to, manipulate the society. Incan civilization was vast. It went all the way from Colombia all the way down to the tail end of Chile. And across this, they built many roads. These roads have massive switchbacks that go up, canyon walls. This is, Machu Picchu down here. But the roads are still intact. You can still travel them and walk them today. There were rope bridges that spanned the chasms, and that allowed you to get quickly from peak to peak or from ridge to ridge without having to go down to the valley. They had a whole system of messengers that would pass off messages, Pony Express style. So one would run for as far as he could, and he'd pass off the message to the next runner. And that system of runners could carry a message from one end of the empire to the other in less than 2 weeks. The Spaniards were kind of aghast at the sophistication of it. So with this, they managed an empire. They, facilitated trade and brought this whole region together. Their capital is in Cusco, Peru, and the modern city of Cusco, Peru is built around Incan civilization. In fact, if you walk around Cusco, you will still see Incan walls and Incan roads. These massive monolithic blocks. They are what we call joggled. Joggled means that instead of ashlar masonry, they have all of these weird tight angles fitted in here. Well, there's a reason for that, and that's because Cusco is geologically active. There's a lot of earthquakes in the region. And so if you build with massive blocks that are locked in like this, they're going to be very, very stable, and they're going to resist those earthquakes. Again, you don't need alien technology to do this. What you need is just an awful lot of patience. The one thing that we do know is that they have these little nodes that stick out, and those were little protrusions that would allow them to lift these blocks with ropes or with scaffolding. And so what you would do is you would, finally make a surface, and then you would take a block, make a pattern, cut the block as close as you could get to the pattern, then lower it into place. And in between the block and the place you were trying to match it up to, you put a thin layer of clay. And anywhere that the clay was rubbed off, that was a high spot that needed to be cut down. And any place that it perfectly matched, the clay would just, meet perfectly. So what they would do is you would do that multiple times. You would cover it with this thin layer of clay, see where it rubbed. Anywhere where the clay rubbed off, you would chisel that part down, refit it again and again and again. And you would fit it multiple times. There's no mortar here. You would just perfectly fit these stones together. And of course, the Inca could do this because they had large workforces and also because they built for the ages. The whole layout of the city is still pretty much dependent on the Incan city. There are 2 major sites on either end of these 2 major roads. The one is the Coricancha. The Coricancha is spelled many different ways, but don't worry about it. The Coricancha was the temple of Inti, the sun god, and was also the residence of the Sapa Inca. And then on the other side is the Sakshway Homan. Let's talk about the Coricancha. So this is the monastery church of Santo Domingo, and it is everything up here you can see was built during the Spanish period, but all of this here and much of this down here was built during the Incan period. And you can tell the quality of masonry is just completely different between the two of these. So when the conquistadors conquered this region, they rebuilt this as a Catholic church to usurp their authority over it. But it would have looked something like this, and this wall here would have been this wall here. And this is probably the location of what was known as the solar drum. The solar drum was a part of the sanctuary that was completely covered in gold. You can see gold lines the upper part of the wall. There were llamas and corn stalks made out of silver, but with the corn made in gold. Whole llamas and other offerings made out of gold. The Spaniards were just aghast at the amount of gold. Some of the original buildings of the Coricancha are still there, and you can go inside and see these niches, these canted trapezoidal style niches, windows, and walls are a feature of Incan architecture. This may be the room where they filled with gold. The story goes that after Atahualpa was taken, they tried to ransom him, and so they asked the Spaniards what they want, and one of the Spaniards came and made a chalk mark as high over his head as he could reach in one of these rooms in the Coricancha. They said, you have to fill this room with gold. And they managed to do it in a very short time, like 2 weeks. And of course, that was the very worst thing you could do to a Spaniard, because the Spaniards never even imagined they could have done it so quickly, and yet they did. And all of that gold probably came from the temples and everything that they stripped clean. The gold was nothing to them compared to the Sapa Inca, which was the real treasure. And so that probably met their downfall, because the Spaniards realized there's a lot more gold here than we ever would have imagined. So imagine this room filled with gold. It might be that very room. On the other end of the valley is the Sakshway Homan. Now, this is often called a citadel, but it too is mostly a sanctuary and not a fortress. Up at the top there is a temple precinct with a Sunken Plaza as well. But the thing that people most recognize are these massive terraces with these absolutely gargantuan blocks of stone. This is where they reenact the Inti Raymi, the annual festival of the sun. And these are where Quechua peoples come and reenact the story of the Sapa Inca. Here is the Sapa Inca underneath the rainbow banner. The rainbow banner was the flag. This isn't Pride Day. This is the actual national flag of the Inca nation. And you can see they're being carried on this litter by these warriors. And here's the Sapa Inca, an actor portraying the Sapa Inca. This is also the location of the Kenko Stone. The Kenko Stone is, again, just right outside, and this is in the center of a place. Again, a natural outcropping of rock that the spiritual forces or the god was believed to reside. And that brings us to the incredible location of Machu Picchu. So Machu Picchu, it's important to remember that the Inca didn't go without a fight. In fact, while Cusco was conquered in 1535, it's not until, nearly 40 years later that the Inca finally succumbed. They managed to go into the rainforest. You have a whole different group of Inca that are surviving, known as the Vilcabamba Inca, and they don't succumb until 1572. Well, there was a story in a Spanish chronicle of the Spanish eventually conquering one of these outlying fortresses of the Inca, and then ultimately was abandoned. Hiram Bingham read that account, and with only that account to guide him, he went looking for this city, and miraculously he found it. Hiram Bingham was a professor at Yale University and is generally regarded as one of the chief inspirations for Indiana Jones. Well, when he found it, it was completely consumed by the jungle, but he cleared it, and this is what it looked like. So a high mountain fortress that could only be reached by a very steep path from the valley or from the adjoining ridge across the saddle. Of course, that made it a naturally defensible location. You can understand why it was so self-sufficient. It is noted for its incredible engineering. Again, we have this massive cyclopean masonry and these whole series of terraces. The terraces allowed them to grow food to supply and, take care of themselves. And it too has what some have called a solar temple, but we're not entirely certain. There's this natural outcropping of rock. So again, any natural outcropping of rock would have instinctively to the Inca seemed like a waka, to represent the presence of the deity. And so they build a temple around it, but this thing was an incredibly special location because underneath the rock was a cave, and in the cave was a spring. And so you bring all of these features together, that becomes evidence for the Inca that this is a truly sacred spot. Because you have the underworld, you have water and caves, which represent the underworld, you have the mountain represented by the rock, and you also have the rock itself, which represents Inti. Of all the things he discovered there, the thing that he was most excited about, Hiram Bingham was most excited about finding, was the Intihuatana. The Intihuatana is the solar hitching post, and it's the best way to describe it. It is a block of natural rock that has been carved away from the natural rock, and it acts kind of like a sundial, but also represents the presence of Inti himself. All of these were destroyed after the conquest, and so this one is probably the only intact one that remained, because it was so remote the Spaniards didn't destroy it. Well, there's not a lot of material culture left from the Inca. Most of it is their incredible architecture and masonry, but we do have some things that have survived. We have these beautiful tunics with these, again, very elaborately woven camelid fibers. We are beginning to wonder if these patterns mean something. Again, nobody's suggesting these are a language system, but they may just be some kind of encoding of, say, crests representing noble families. We also have some ceramics. There's our staff god again, and a few items in gold. This is a nose jewel, again, with the spider motif, a very common motif in the Andean world, as well as some votives of humans and also of llamas. I'm trying to work a "yay, I'm a llama again" joke into this, but I just can't. I'm tapped out, people. It's a shame. Let's move on. So I do want to talk just briefly about the archaeology of Colombia. This is also one of the other rich regions that we have here. We have a number of cultures here that are not Andean civilizations. They are independent civilizations. They're no doubt influenced by these, but they too are just expert workers in gold. So we have a whole variety of gold figures that come from these. Probably the most significant are the Muisca. This is where the legend of El Dorado comes from. We imagine El Dorado as a city, but it actually originally referred to a chieftain that would cover himself in gold dust and then dive into a lake. And of course this would wash off the gold dust, and then he would come out of the lake. And so this was a way of making this offering. And many people have imagined that this golden raft is a representation of that chieftain doing that symbolic sacrifice. We also have some pretty amazing gold representations of chieftains from the Quimbaya culture, and a few monolithic statues of the San Agustin culture that were used to make these platforms that would have been tomb platforms. The last thing I want to close on is the Amazon basin. There are so many other cultures. I haven't talked about any of the cultures of the Rio de Plata. There's just too much to cover, and I have to make choices. But I do want to give a sense of just how much we've lost. For the longest time, the opinion was that the Amazon basin was just impenetrable. It's one of the last unexplored regions on Earth. And if you've ever been there, you can understand why. It's such an incredibly dense jungle. In fact, some of the last uncontacted tribes in the world are there. This is a tribe that were shooting arrows at a low-flying airplane. So we decide they don't want us. We don't want to bother them, and we certainly don't want to bring our diseases and boy bands and other modern plagues to them either. So we leave them alone. And it was the assumption that for most of its history, the Amazon forest was just this primordial forest with not much in the way of civilization. And then we started discovering this stuff. Now, it's kind of strange, but the Amazon forest, as lush as it is, actually has very, very poor soil. It has this incredibly rich life on it, but the soil is mostly sandy clay that doesn't have a lot of nutrients. In fact, you can see it's the sandy clay over on the one side. But they started to discover these places in the middle of the Amazon forest that they called Terra Preta, this dark earth. And this dark earth had very rich soil, rich organic matter. And for the longest time, they thought it's just a kind of interesting quirk of biology that some spots are more fertile than others. And then people started noticing, they started plotting out this Terra Preta, this dark earth, and they discovered that it forms into perfect rectangles. And those rectangles are separated by perfectly even walkways and evenly spaced walkways, and then you have another perfect rectangle of exactly the same size. There's no way that could be accidental or biological. It has to be man-made. And so we now know that these places were probably fertilized. They were probably made by human beings who brought, fish and other fertilizing materials to create this nutrient soil. That means that these places that are now under the rainforest were once cultivated and once civilized. And then, because of the slash and burn agriculture, we started to see these massive geoglyphs emerge. People started noticing these on Google Earth and started documenting them. Regular geometric shapes. These are not things being made by, small little tribes over a long period of time. They're obviously being made by very sophisticated cultures. And we're beginning to believe that large chunks, maybe even as much as 75% of what we call the Amazon rain basin, was once cultivated land. If that's true, it probably could have supported 80 million people. I think that's a little high in the estimate range, but certainly millions of people were living there and making geoglyphs. There have been stories of lost cities in the Amazon for a very, very long time. Percy Fawcett, the lost city of Z. You may have heard some of these stories, and there may be some truth to them. And now with LiDAR technology and more discoveries, we're beginning to see just how tragic the loss of civilization was. The reason when the conquistadors came, they brought smallpox with them, and these massive pandemics. Gosh, it seems scary to talk about pandemics anymore, but these massive pandemics wiped out the local civilization, and we now think that it's entirely possible that the pandemics reached these civilizations in the Amazon and wiped them out, and they were completely consumed by the jungle before any European even knew they were gone. So there's lots more to discover. There's obviously a lot we don't know. I'm not saying aliens, but definitely there's a lot more yet to discover. So we'll stop there, and we'll come back with pre-classic Mesoamerican next time. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.